The morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside like a burial shroud, obscuring the network of trenches and earthworks that would soon earn Cold Harbor its grim reputation as one of the bloodiest battlefields in American history. Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood motionless beside his command tent, his weathered face betraying none of the doubt that gnawed at him as he contemplated the assault planned for dawn on June 3, 1860-4. Grant had pursued Confederate General Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia relentlessly through the Overland Campaign, bleeding his own forces white at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. Now, at this crossroads, hamlet northeast of Richmond, he faced an enemy that had learned the deadly art of defensive warfare with terrifying efficiency. Lee's veterans had spent the previous days constructing an intricate maze of trenches, rifle pits, and artillery positions that transformed the rolling farmland into a fortress designed for a slaughter. The Union commander's strategy had evolved throughout the spring campaign into a war of attrition that horrified even his own generals. Major General George Gordon Meade had privately expressed reservations about the frontal assault, but Grant remained convinced that one more coordinated attack would shatter Lee's diminished army and open the road to Richmond. The mathematics of war seemed to favor the Union. Grant commanded nearly 110,000 men against Lee's approximately 60,000, and the Confederacy could ill afford to replace its losses, as referenced in Bruce Catan's comprehensive account. A stillness at Appomattox. The Confederate positions at Cold Harbor represented the evolution of Civil War tactics from Napoleonic charges to the trench warfare that would later define the Western Front of World War I. Lee's engineers had created overlapping fields of fire, with artillery placed to inflate any attacking force, while sharpshooters occupied positions that commanded every avenue of approach. The Confederate earthworks stretched for nearly 7 miles, following the natural contours of the landscape, to maximize defensive advantage. Behind these fortifications, Lee's battle-hardened veterans waited with the grim patience of men who had survived 3 years of increasingly brutal warfare. They had witnessed the transformation of their conflict from a gentleman's war fought with elaborate courtesy to a savage struggle for national survival. General Lee himself moved among his positions that evening, his presence inspiring confidence in troops who had followed him through victory and defeat. The Confederate commander understood that his army's survival depended not on offensive action, but on making every Union advance so costly that Northern public opinion would eventually force a negotiated peace. Cold Harbor offered the perfect terrain for such a strategy. Grant's own soldiers sensed the approaching catastrophe with the prescience that comes to veterans of prolonged combat. He wrote their names and addresses on pieces of paper, pinning them to their uniforms so their bodies could be identified after the battle. This morbid preparation had become a ritual before major assaults. Never had it been practiced so widely as in the camps around Cold Harbor. The stage was set for a confrontation that would epitomize the tragic futility of frontal assaults against entrenched defenders, marking a turning point in military thinking that would reverberate through future conflicts. As darkness fell on June 2nd, both armies prepared for a dawn that would etch Cold Harbor's name in blood across the pages of American history. The pre-dawn darkness of June 3rd, 1864, shattered with the roar of Union artillery. As Grant's guns opened their preparatory bombardment at 4:30 in the morning, for 30 minutes, Federal cannons hurled shell and shot at the Confederate earthworks, hoping to soften the defenses before the infantry assault. The thunder of guns rolled across the Virginia countryside, awakening sleeping civilians miles away, who would later describe the sound as resembling a continuous summer storm. At precisely 5 o'clock, the order came down through the Union ranks. Forward, march. 3 corps of Grant's army rose from their positions and advanced toward the Confederate lines with parade ground precision. The 18th Corps, under Major General William Farrar Smith, moved against the Confederate right, while the 6th Corps, commanded by Major General Horatio Governor Wright, struck the center, and Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps assaulted the left flank of Lee's position. The advancing Federal soldiers presented a magnificent and terrible spectacle as they emerged from the morning mist. Regimental colors fluttered in the humid air, while drums beat the cadence of attack. Officers on horseback rode alongside their men, swords drawn, shouting encouragement over the growing din of battle. For a brief moment, the assault possessed all the pageantry and grandeur that had characterized earlier battles of the war. Then the Confederate defenses erupted in a storm of fire that transformed military pageantry into industrial slaughter. Lee's artillery, carefully positioned and precisely ranged, opened with devastating effect on the exposed Union formations. Canister shot tore gaps in the Federal ranks, while rifle fire from the trenches created overlapping fields of death that no mortal force could penetrate. The 12th New Hampshire Infantry, advancing as part of Smith's Corps, suffered particularly grievous losses as they approached the Confederate works near the Bethesda Church Road. Colonel Joseph Hale Potter watched helplessly as his regiment melted away under the withering fire. Men falling in such numbers that the ground disappeared beneath the carpet of blue uniforms, Hancock's Second Corps, veterans of Gettysburg and countless other battles, found themselves trapped in a killing field where Confederate marksmen had pre-registered every fold in the ground. The experienced soldiers quickly sought whatever cover they could find, scraping shallow depressions in the earth with bayonets and tin cups while bullets whined overhead like deadly insects. Major General Francis Channing Barlow's division suffered catastrophic casualties within the first few minutes of the assault. The general himself fell wounded, adding to the growing list of senior officers struck down in the futile advance. Regimental commanders found themselves leading companies, while sergeants took charge of decimated battalions. The Confederate response was swift and merciless. Behind their earthworks, Lee's soldiers fired with mechanical precision, their rifles heated to burning by the rapid discharge. Ammunition bearers ran constantly between the firing line and supply points, maintaining the deadly volume of fire that swept the approaches to the Confederate position. General Lee observed the battle from an elevated position behind his lines, watching through field glasses as Grant's assault dissolved into chaos. The Confederate commander felt no satisfaction in the slaughter, understanding that each Federal casualty represented someone's son, brother, or father. Yet military necessity demanded that he extract the maximum cost for every yard of ground Grant sought to gain. By 6 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour after the assault began, the attack had reached its high water mark. Scattered Union soldiers hugged the ground within 100 yards of the Confederate works. Unable to advance or retreat under the murderous fire, the dream of breaking Lee's army in a single coordinated assault lay shattered among the growing piles of Federal dead and wounded. The sun climbed higher over the battlefield, illuminating a scene of carnage that would haunt the memories of survivors. For decades to come, between the Union and Confederate lines lay a ghastly carpet of blue uniforms, marking the farthest advance of Grant's assault. The wounded cried out for water and medical attention, their voices creating a chorus of agony that could be heard above the sporadic gunfire that continued to claim lives throughout the morning hours. Major General John Gibbon's division of Hancock's Second Corps had pushed closer to the Confederate works than any other unit, with some soldiers reaching within 50 yards of the enemy trenches before being forced to seek cover. These men now found themselves in an impossible situation, pinned down by Confederate sharpshooters who commanded every route of escape. Any attempt to retreat across the open ground would result in certain death. The Federal artillery, which had proven so ineffective during the preparatory bombardment, continued to fire throughout the morning in a desperate attempt to suppress the Confederate defenses. Captain John Hazard's battery of the 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery had positioned its guns dangerously close to the enemy lines, and the artillerymen paid a terrible price for their bravery. Confederate counter battery fire dismounted several cannons and inflicted heavy casualties among the gun crews. General Grant, receiving reports from his corps commanders, initially refused to believe the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before Cold Harbor. Accustomed to frontal assaults that achieved at least partial success, he ordered renewed attacks. Throughout the morning, each one meeting the same fate as the dawn assault. The 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, serving as infantry, lost over 600 men in a single charge that lasted less than 20 minutes, as chronicled in Douglas Southall, Freeman's detailed military histories, the Confederate defensive system at Cold Harbor represented the pinnacle of Civil War fortification engineering, combining traditional earthworks with innovative techniques that maximized the killing power of rifled muskets and artillery. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where no living thing could survive, while the depth of the defensive positions allowed Lee to shift reserves quickly to meet any breakthrough attempt. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's brigade, veterans of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, found themselves facing an impregnable position near the Mechanicsville Road. Chamberlain, still recovering from wounds received at Petersburg, watched his men fall in steady succession as they attempted to find weaknesses in the Confederate line. The hero of Gettysburg would later write that Cold Harbor presented the most hopeless tactical situation he had ever encountered. The Confederate soldiers, initially elated by their defensive success, gradually fell silent as the magnitude of the slaughter became apparent. Many had fought at Malvern Hill and Fredericksburg, where they had witnessed similar scenes from the receiving end of defensive fire. Now, watching Union soldiers fall in such numbers, even hardened veterans felt a mixture of pride and revulsion at the efficiency of their killing. Lee's medical services, though better organized than their Union counterparts, faced their own challenges in dealing with Confederate casualties. While significantly lighter than Federal losses, the wounded still required immediate attention. The constant Union artillery fire made movement behind the lines dangerous for stretcher bearers and surgeons. By noon, the assault had clearly failed, but Grant's stubborn nature prevented him from officially calling off the attack. Individual commanders along the line began making their own decisions, pulling their men back to whatever cover they could find and establishing a new line of battle several hundred yards from the Confederate works. The dream of crushing Lee's army in a single blow had become a nightmare of unprecedented proportions. The temperature rose steadily throughout the day, adding heat exhaustion to the list of casualties. Wounded men lying in the no-man's land between. The army suffered terribly from thirst and exposure, their cries for help growing weaker as the hours passed. Neither side dared venture into the killing field to recover the wounded, creating a humanitarian crisis that would persist for days. The afternoon of June 3rd brought no respite from the horror that had engulfed Cold Harbor since dawn. General Grant, his jaw set with the determination that had carried him from Fort Donelson to Vicksburg, struggled with a decision that would define his legacy. Reports from his corps' commanders painted an increasingly grim picture. The 6th Corps had lost nearly 1,500 men in their initial assault, while the 18th Corps suffered even more grievous casualties in their futile attacks against the Confederate right flank. Colonel Emory Upton, the innovative tactician who had developed new assault techniques at Spotsylvania, found his methods useless against the killing field of Cold Harbor. His brigade had advanced with the precision that had brought success in previous battles, only to be shredded by Confederate fire before reaching the enemy works. Upton himself was wounded in the thigh, but continued to direct his men from a position barely 200 yards from Lee's trenches. The Federal soldiers trapped between the lines faced a torment that tested the limits of human endurance. Private James Robertson of the 5th New Hampshire Infantry lay wounded in both legs, unable to move while Confederate sharpshooters waited for any sign of life among the bodies scattered across the field. Robertson would later describe the experience as lying in hell itself, surrounded by the dead and dying while bullets continued to search for living targets. Lee's artillery continued to exact a terrible toll throughout the afternoon, as Union commanders attempted piecemeal attacks against different sections of the Confederate line. Captain William Pegram's battery of Virginia artillery had found the perfect position to enfilade any Federal advance along the Cold Harbor Road, and his guns spoke with deadly precision whenever Union troops showed themselves in the open. Confederate commander himself moved among his positions during the afternoon lull, observing the carnage with the eye of a professional soldier. Lee understood that Cold Harbor represented both a tactical triumph and a strategic challenge. While his army had inflicted devastating casualties on Grant's forces, the Union commander's seemingly inexhaustible supply of reinforcements meant that such victories might prove Pyrrhic in the long term. Major General Jubal Anderson Early's corps, positioned on the Confederate left, had repulsed multiple attacks throughout the day with minimal losses to their own ranks. Early, known for his caustic wit and aggressive nature, watched the federal assaults with professional interest. Noting how Grant's tactics had evolved since the beginning of the Overland Campaign, the Confederate general recognized that while Union losses were staggering, Grant's willingness to accept such casualties represented a fundamental shift in the war's character. The Union medical services faced an unprecedented crisis as wounded soldiers streamed back from the failed assaults. Surgeon Jonathan Letterman's ambulance corps, efficient though it was, could not cope with the sheer volume of casualties. Field hospitals established in nearby farmhouses overflowed with wounded men, while surgeons worked without rest to save lives and limbs, as detailed in contemporary accounts preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. The psychological impact of Cold Harbor extended far beyond the immediate casualties, affecting the morale of both armies in profound ways that would influence future operations. General Grant's headquarters buzzed with activity as staff officers attempted to assess the day's losses and plan future operations. Colonel Horace Porter, Grant's aide-de-camp, later recorded that the general spent long periods in silent contemplation, his usual stoic demeanor cracking under the weight of responsibility for the day's carnage. The Confederate soldiers, despite their defensive success, found themselves sobered by the magnitude of federal casualties. Many had fought throughout the war without witnessing such one-sided slaughter, and the sight of Union dead piled 3 deep in some areas created a sense of unease even among Lee's veterans. Sergeant William Dame of the Richmond Howitzers wrote to his sister that evening, describing Cold Harbor as a victory that brought no joy. As evening approached, both armies settled into a tense standoff, with Union forces establishing defensive positions several hundred yards from the Confederate works. The sounds of battle gradually diminished, replaced by the moans of wounded men lying between the lines and the methodical work of stretcher bearers attempting to recover the injured under cover of darkness. The day that had begun with such high hopes for a decisive Union victory had become synonymous with the futility of frontal assaults against well-prepared defensive positions, establishing Cold Harbor as a symbol of military miscalculation that would influence tactical thinking for generations to come. The night of June 3rd brought little peace to the armies. Facing each other across the deadly ground of Cold Harbor, between the Union and Confederate lines, lay hundreds of wounded Federal soldiers, their cries for help creating a constant reminder of the day's carnage. The no-man's land stretched for several hundred yards in most places, dotted with bodies and abandoned equipment that marked the high tide of Grant's failed assault. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the 2nd Corps, spent the night wrestling with the impossible situation facing his trapped soldiers. Elements of his command remained pinned down within rifle shot of the Confederate works, unable to retreat without exposing themselves to certain death. Hancock, veteran of Antietam and Gettysburg, had never faced such a tactically hopeless position, where military necessity conflicted so directly with human compassion. The Confederate pickets maintained their vigilance throughout the night, firing at any movement they detected among the Union positions. Sergeant James Caldwell of the 1st South Carolina Infantry described the eerie atmosphere in letters home, writing that the battlefield resembled a vast charnel house where the living feared to tread among the dead. Young soldier admitted that even hardened veterans found the sight of so many Federal casualties deeply disturbing. General Lee spent much of the night in consultation with his corps' commanders, planning defensive improvements that would make his position even more impregnable. The Confederate commander understood that Grant's nature would likely compel him to renew the assault, and Lee was determined to exact an even higher price for any future attacks. Engineers worked through the darkness, deepening trenches and improving artillery positions under the direction of skilled officers like Captain Charles Dimmock. The Federal wounded lying between the lines faced a night of unimaginable torment. Private Samuel Wilkeson of the 143rd Pennsylvania Infantry had been shot through both legs during the morning assault and now lay helpless among the dead, listening to the groans of other wounded men while Confederate sharpshooters maintained their deadly watch. Many soldiers would later testify that the sounds from no man's land were more horrible than the noise of battle itself. Union surgeons attempted to organize rescue missions under cover of darkness, but Confederate fire made such efforts suicidal. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's chief medical officer, found himself powerless to help the wounded soldiers lying within sight of his field hospitals. The medical protocols that had worked effectively in previous battles proved inadequate when faced with the tactical stalemate that had developed at Cold Harbor. Grant's headquarters remained active throughout the night as the general and his staff grappled with the implications of the day's disaster. Colonel Ely Parker, Grant's military secretary, noted that the usually composed commander showed signs of strain as reports continued to arrive detailing the extent of Federal casualties. The preliminary estimates suggested that Grant had lost over 7,000 men in less than an hour of fighting, casualties that exceeded those of many entire battles earlier in the war. The psychological impact of Cold Harbor extended throughout both armies, affecting veterans who had considered themselves inured to the horrors of warfare. Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., serving with the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, wrote in his diary that Cold Harbor represented a new circle of hell where modern weapons had made traditional tactics not merely obsolete but homicidal. Confederate medical personnel, though dealing with far fewer casualties than their Union counterparts, faced their own challenges in treating wounded soldiers while maintaining the offensive positions that had proven so effective. Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire, Stonewall Jackson's former medical director, now serving with Lee's army, established aid stations behind the earthworks where wounded Confederate soldiers could receive treatment without exposing themselves to Federal sharpshooters. The temperature remained oppressive throughout the night, aiding to the suffering of wounded men on both sides. The humid Virginia climate, which had sapped the strength of both armies throughout the overland campaign, now became another enemy for soldiers lying exposed between the lines. Many men who might have survived their wounds succumbed to dehydration and heat exhaustion during the long night hours. As dawn approached on June 4th, both armies remained locked in their deadly embrace, with Union forces unable to advance or retreat while Confederate defenders maintained their vigilant watch. The tactical situation had created a humanitarian crisis that would test the limits of military convention and human decency in the days to come. Dawn on June 4th revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen Grant's army at Cold Harbor. As the morning mist lifted, Confederate soldiers peering over their earthworks could see the field carpeted with Federal casualties stretching back toward the Union lines. The sight sobered even the most hardened veterans who understood that they were witnessing warfare on a scale that transcended previous experience. General Grant faced pressure from multiple directions as the new day began. His subordinate commanders reported that their units were demoralized and unable to renew the assault without significant reinforcement and reorganization. Major General George Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac, privately expressed his belief that further frontal attacks would constitute murder rather than military strategy. The usually aggressive Meade had been shaken by the previous day's casualties and urged Grant to reconsider his tactical approach. The wounded Federal soldiers lying between the lines endured a night of agony that few human beings could comprehend. Those still conscious called constantly for water, their voices growing weaker as dehydration took its toll. Confederate soldiers, despite orders to maintain fire discipline, found it increasingly difficult to shoot at stretcher-bearers attempting to reach the wounded. Several informal truces developed along different sections of the line as common. Humanity overcame military necessity. Lee's army, while celebrating their defensive success, grappled with the moral implications of the slaughter they had inflicted. Chaplain William Pendleton of the Confederate Army conducted impromptu services for soldiers troubled by the carnage, reminding them that they fought in defense of their homeland. Many Confederate veterans later wrote that Cold Harbor marked the moment when warfare ceased to be glorious and became purely a matter of survival. The tactical situation remained unchanged throughout June 4th, with neither side able to gain advantage through movement or maneuver. Grant's army found itself trapped in positions that offered no possibility of successful assault, while Lee's forces remained confined to their trenches by the continuing threat of Federal attack. The stalemate represented a new form of warfare that would presage the static battles of World War I 50 years in the future. Federal artillery continued to bombard the Confederate positions throughout the day, though with little effect against the well-constructed earthworks. Captain John Hazard's battery of Rhode Island artillery had repositioned during the night to avoid Confederate counter-battery fire, but their guns still could not significantly damage Lee's fortifications. The ineffectiveness of artillery against prepared defensive positions had become painfully apparent to Union commanders, as documented in the memoirs of participants and later compiled by the National Park Service. The humanitarian crisis at Cold Harbor forced both armies to confront questions about the rules of warfare and the treatment of wounded soldiers that had never before required resolution. Confederate sharpshooters, many of them veteran marksmen from the mountains of Virginia and North Carolina, maintained constant pressure on any Union movement they could observe. These skilled riflemen had turned the approaches to Lee's position into a death trap, where movement during daylight hours became virtually impossible. Their deadly accuracy had effectively paralyzed Grant's army without requiring major combat operations. The heat continued to build throughout the day, creating additional suffering for wounded soldiers on both sides. Union medical personnel, frustrated by their inability to reach the wounded lying between the lines, began planning desperate rescue attempts that would require volunteers willing to sacrifice their lives for their wounded comrades. Grant himself spent the day in brooding contemplation, walking among his troops and observing firsthand the demoralization that had settled over his command. The general who had earned fame for his relentless pursuit of Confederate armies now faced a situation where persistence had become futility. Staff officers noted that Grant aged visibly during those June days, the weight of command and casualty, reports taking their toll on even his iron constitution. As another night fell over the battlefield, both armies prepared for what many sensed would be a prolonged stalemate. With thousands of wounded men lying helpless between forces that could neither advance nor retreat without prohibitive casualties, June 12, 1864, marked the end of the tactical stalemate at Cold Harbor when General Grant finally ordered his army to withdraw under cover of darkness. The Union commander's decision came only after a week of failed attempts to break Lee's defensive line and the growing realization that further assaults would accomplish nothing beyond adding to the already staggering casualty lists. Grant's acknowledgement of defeat at Cold Harbor would later be remembered as one of the most difficult decisions of his military career. The final casualty figures told a story of unprecedented carnage compressed into a remarkably brief period. Grant's army had suffered approximately 7,000 casualties on June 3 alone, with total losses during the Cold Harbor campaign exceeding 13,000 men. Lee's army, by contrast, had lost fewer than 1,500 soldiers during the entire engagement, creating a casualty ratio that demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of defensive warfare when properly executed. The withdrawal itself became a complex military operation as Union forces attempted to disengage from positions within rifle shot of Confederate earthworks. Many Federal soldiers remained trapped between the lines, and the humanitarian crisis created by their situation forced both commanders to negotiate one of the few formal truces of the war. On June 7th, Grant had finally requested permission to recover his wounded, a request that Lee granted with characteristic courtesy despite the military advantage such negotiations represented. The truce that allowed Federal stretcher-bearers to recover their wounded provided both armies with their first clear view of the battlefield's devastation. Confederate soldiers who ventured into no man's land to assist with the recovery operations were stunned by the density of Federal casualties. Many piled 2 and 3 deep in areas where successive waves of attack had been stopped by defensive fire. The sight reinforced their understanding that they had participated in something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. Major General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, hero of Gettysburg, later wrote extensively about Cold Harbor's impact on Civil War tactics and strategy. Chamberlain observed that the battle marked the definitive end of Napoleonic warfare in America, demonstrating conclusively that rifled muskets and artillery had made frontal assaults against prepared positions obsolete. His analysis would influence military thinking for decades after the war's end. The psychological wounds inflicted at Cold Harbor proved as lasting as the physical casualties. Veterans of both armies carried memories of the battle's carnage throughout their lives, many expressing in post-war writings that Cold Harbor had fundamentally changed their understanding of warfare's nature. The battle became synonymous with military futility, a cautionary tale about the dangers of persisting with tactics that had been rendered obsolete by technological advancement. Lee's tactical victory at Cold Harbor paradoxically weakened his strategic position by demonstrating to Northern leaders that Confederate resistance remained formidable despite 3 years of warfare. The battle's outcome convinced Grant to abandon a strategy of frontal assault in favor of a war of maneuver and siege that would ultimately prove more effective in achieving Union objectives. Cold Harbor thus marked not just a tactical defeat for the Union, but a strategic turning point in Grant's approach to defeating Lee's army. The battlefield itself became a monument to the evolution of military technology and tactics, with the elaborate system of trenches and earthworks serving as a preview of the Western Front that would characterize World War I. Military observers from European armies studied the Cold Harbor fortifications, recognizing their significance for future conflicts where defensive firepower would dominate tactical considerations. In the decades following the war, Cold Harbor assumed symbolic importance beyond its immediate military significance. The battle came to represent the tragic cost of military miscalculation and the human price of technological change in warfare. Veterans' reunions and historical commemorations consistently identified Cold Harbor as the moment when warfare ceased to be romantic and became purely industrial in its scale and character. The lessons of Cold Harbor influenced American military doctrine well into the 20th century, serving as a case study in the importance of adapting tactics to technological realities. The battle's legacy extended beyond purely military considerations to encompass broader questions about leadership, sacrifice, and the moral obligations of commanders to their subordinates in the face of seemingly impossible tactical situations. Today, Cold Harbor stands as one of the best-preserved Civil War battlefields. Its network of trenches and earthworks, providing visitors with a tangible connection to one of the conflict's most significant engagements. The site serves as a reminder that even in warfare's darkest moments, human courage and sacrifice can transcend the immediate circumstances of battle to create lasting meaning from tragedy and loss.